Welcome to Whose Independence Day Is It? A Class Act Forum on Social Justice and Racism in America. I'm Marion Dry, co-chair with Jonathan Sprague of Class Act HR 73. This evening, Class Act is honored to present our distinguished panelists in this forum on social justice and racism. There is no more important conversation than this one. Sylvester Monroe, our moderator, is an award-winning journalist and a former editor of the Washington Post. Over his career, he has had assignments at Newsweek, Time, the San Jose Mercury News, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and Ebony. A longtime member of the National Association of Black Journalists, Sylvester has also served on the board of St. George's Preparatory School and is a sought-after speaker. He's currently working on a book, The Class of 73, The Struggle for Diversity, about the Black men of the Harvard class of 1973. Welcome, Sylvester.
Thank you, Marion. Before I begin, I should say you are too kind. I was a foreign editor, assistant foreign editor at the Washington Post, not the editor. And before I get in trouble, my book is not just about the Black men in the Harvard class of 73, but Black men and women. I am thrilled to be here today and to speak with a really stellar panel. We are expecting to be joined by Congresswoman Karen Bass, who represents the 37th District of California and is the current chair of the Congressional Black Caucus. And she should be joining us shortly. Also on our stellar panel, award-winning journalist and author, Soledad O'Brien, who hosts the syndicated show Matter of Fact, and Stephen Milliken, a member of the Harvard class of 73, founder and president of JusticeAid, and a former Superior Court judge. So to get started here we are, almost 60 years after the March on Washington for social justice and equality, and Black people and people of color still find themselves having to march for equal protection under the law and for social equality and social justice. Steve, there has been some, in the wake of the killing of George Floyd, the protests that have followed, the Congresswoman actually has introduced legislation, the George Floyd Police Reforming Act of 2020, which passed the House on Friday. Stephen, could you tell us a little bit about what that aims to do and how effective it might be?
Absolutely. Thank you, Sylvester. The George Floyd Justice in Policing Act of 2020 is a reform bill that has passed the House. And what it does, many things, including at the top, to change the criminal intent in a police brutality prosecution from one of willfulness to one of recklessness. Second, it limits qualified immunity for police officers. It authorizes the Department of Justice to issue subpoenas to law enforcement. It creates a national registry of police officers so that police officers who have records of misconduct can't just slip off to another department and get hired without any responsibility for their past. It prohibits profiling, pretextual arrests, which have plagued people of color, and particularly Black men. It also requires certain reporting and training in bias, and it emphasizes the need for police cameras to be turned on all the time.
So it aims to sort of make police more accountable.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So it was the police who, I mean, the issues of police reform that got us here, that brought us here to this moment. But this is broader than that. Soledad, do you feel like in wake of watching the protests and whatnot over the past few weeks, that we are in a moment here where we have an opportunity perhaps to deal with some of the issues of race and social justice?
I think that's a $64,000 question, right? Is it a moment or is it a movement? Is it something that we're going to look back and say, we reached a pivot point and that's when things changed? Or is it going to be something that just, passes us by? So for me, I think it's different than things have felt in the past. And having done many documentaries on the civil rights movement 60 years ago, I think we are at a time when we've had numerous very public events. I think coronavirus actually forced people into a situation where they were home and available for protest, frankly. I think these very high profile killings, Ahmaud Arbery, in addition to George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Amy Cooper, the woman in New York City with her dog, and Chris Cooper, who I always refer to as the handsome birder, having their moment where, I think those are all pieces of a puzzle that kind of had a tipping point when we watched a police officer put his knee into the neck of George Floyd for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. So I think all of those things have helped turn this into a bigger than a moment. The question is, will it actually turn into a movement? It feels different to me. It feels different for a handful of reasons. I think it's forcing many organizations, many companies, many industries to sort of look at themselves. I think we have a number of African-American employees within some of those organizations who have, because of social media, found their voices and taken this moment to talk about where they have seen challenges within their own industry or within their own organization. And you couldn't really do that without a number of people who were placed highly enough that they actually could move the needle within their own organizations. Every single company that I've spoken to about this has not a lot, but more than a handful of senior Black leaders who are helping guide the CEO if they're having these conversations in any kind of serious way. I don't think that would have existed 20, 30 years ago. So I think that's also a critical mass. And then I think you're also really, I had a number of people sort of DM me on social media, white dudes, probably 15, maybe 20, who said, I always thought that people who were stopped by the police had kind of sort of done something, right? Like they weren't stopping Girl Scouts, that, maybe it wasn't exactly the crime that, but for the most part, if you were having an interaction with the cops, you were guilty of something. And I think they've seen so many videos come out of both the George Floyd killing and all these other things I mentioned, and then the follow-up in the protests, many instances of just police brutality or just sort of cruel behavior. And I think they're really stunned. I think for people who haven't lived it and experienced it, are for many, for the first time, saying, wow, I believe this actually happens now, that this is a problem. And because of that, I am hopeful, more than I have been in the last 10 years, that this will move out of being just a little moment and move into being a bigger movement.
Yeah, so what we're really talking about here is the issue of race. And Steve, those things that the Police Reform Act tried to do, accountability, we have laws already, that, are supposed on the books. I mean, from Civil Rights Act, school desegregation, there's always, laws are only as good as the people who enforce them. How do we change, Steve? What we're talking about is changing the culture of policing. How do we do that? Steve?
I think the elements of the reform bill that Congresswoman Bass has introduced are absolutely essential. I would suggest that they are absolutely necessary, but not sufficient, because police brutality is just the tip of the iceberg of white supremacist devaluation of Black lives, of all BIPOC communities. And so it's not just bad cops or a broken system. I would suggest that the criminal system and policing are not broken, with roots in enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act, Black codes, Jim Crow, lynching, and now mass incarceration. I think they're working very well to their intended purpose of protecting white privilege and oppressing people of color, especially African Americans and particularly Black men, through a campaign of terror that has been ongoing for a very, very long time. There are many good police officers. It's the system. It's the system that trains incoming officers in warrior policing, to be on guard all the time, to kill out of fear of being killed, and responding with conditions response of violence. If I can just speak to Philando Castillo's situation, he is busted for a broken taillight. And the officer, Geronimo, I think his name is Yanez, confronts him, and Mr. Castillo says, "I have a registered weapon," and his girlfriend implores the officer not to shoot him. And we witnessed him being shot 7 times to death over essentially a driving while black offense. What people don't know is the background on the training of that officer. He was trained in part by a Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman, a former Army Ranger. And he founded and runs an organization called the Killology Institute, which you really couldn't make up if you tried. This is a person who trains thousands of police officers, has something like 200 training dates a year on his calendar. And he said, and I quote him, "If you are prepared, killing is just not that big a deal." And he tells his classes that if they are not prepared to kill, they should not become police officers. So the culture that allows for this stop and killing, and then under these historic and awful qualified immunity laws that allow the officer to be acquitted. Officer Yanez was acquitted of all charges in connection with the killing of Philando.
I want to interrupt you for a second. So yeah, what we're talking about here is these false perceptions. I'm told that Congresswoman Karen Bass has joined us, and we'd like to welcome her. Congresswoman, are you here?
I am.
Oh, so nice to see you again. Steve and Soledad and I were talking about the opportunities that this present wave of protests have brought. I mean, you've been quoted, you've said that in 1992, after the LA disturbances in LA following the verdicts of the non-guilty verdicts for the police officers tried in the beating of Rodney King, that we missed an opportunity, that there's an opportunity here. Could you talk a little bit more about what the opportunity we have to deal with these issues, not just of police, but race in general?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for including me today. It's good to see you, Sylvester and Soledad. Good to see you as well. We've worked together on many different projects. You know, it was really the not so much the civil unrest, yes, but in 1991, the videotape. I mean, I had worked on police abuse issues for decades, and when the videotape happened, we all thought it was over. It was finally on tape. It was proven what we had been saying for years, and for sure those officers were going to get convicted. And when they didn't get convicted, it was a devastating blow. And then you fast forward a few years and cell phone cameras are invented. And then we say again, here we are, we have the proof. But after every video, people would say, well, we don't know what happened before the video went on, and we don't know what this person really did. And it's like the justice system goes out the window, because I don't really care what the person did. You usually arrest somebody, put them on trial, and you're usually innocent until proven guilty. Dylan Roof was, after he massacred 9 people at that church, and they peacefully arrested him. And so, but I think that the 8.5 minutes of a murder that everybody witnessed, of a man who was laying down, was just too much. And so I think we have reached a point where, to me, there has been a seismic shift. I mean, you used to see this in polling, where you would poll white people, you poll black people, and they would say the exact opposite opinion about police. And now you have 70% of white folks who are saying there's a problem. Never happened before. And so also you have people protesting in 50 states in the union and around the world protesting for human rights in the United States. All 54 African countries went to the United Nations and said there is a with racism in police in the United States. And so I do think that that has provided a stage for us to have the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. I heard Steve go through some of the major components of it. But when we went through the committee hearings and the committee vote and the floor vote and all of that, my Republican colleagues talked about everything under the sun but the bill. I mean, the only thing missing was Hillary's emails. I mean, they talked about Flynn. They talked about everything. To me, I viewed that positively because they weren't tearing the bill to shreds. And then they came up to me afterwards and told me, what they agreed with and all of that. And so we passed it out of the House. It died in the Senate. But that doesn't mean that it's over. That's just part of the sausage. That's just part of the process. And so now I'm engaging in a number of conversations with my Republican colleagues. Now, I've only been in Congress 10 years, which makes me a newbie compared to some of my other friends. But nobody's ever seen a moment like this. My question and challenge to all of us is, will we get continuing? We won't. So we have to keep the pressure on.
And how do we do that?
Well, the very clear way to do that is the people in the street. We need it to be peaceful. But now there's this whole new world of social media that, of course, didn't exist when I was a youngster and first beginning working on these issues. But we need celebrities because we're a celebrity culture. And we need to pound on the senators that are up for election because at the end of the day, that's what it's always about. And we have senators that are teetering now. The other thing that I did mention about the House that was really remarkable was we got 3 Republicans to vote for the bill. The reason that was remarkable was because the president tweeted. And usually when the president tweets, they sit up and it's like, okay, what am I supposed to do? The president tweeted. And they went against him and voted for the bill. That's like a really big deal here. Senators in several states, we only need to pick up a few seats. So the name of the game here is somebody's being vulnerable for their reelection. If we focus our pressure, social media pressure, phone calls, people in the street, that's what makes this place move. Congress can move in 30 days or 30 years. And it took us 30 days to pull together the Justice and Policing Act. And tragically, we voted for it on Tamir Rice's 18th birthday, the child that was murdered when he was 12 by a police officer who had been fired from another jurisdiction. Our bill provides for a registry of bad officers. So if our bill had been in place 7 years ago, he would have graduated high school and reached his 18th birthday because the police chief would have known that the officer that lied was fired because he was viewed as unstable with a propensity to violence. He shot him within seconds of jumping out of his car.
But the overarching issue in all of these, whether we're talking about police shootings or
Yes.
people getting equal access to opportunity in whatever field, is the issue of race. And there's some people now who believe that race is such an intractable problem in America that perhaps we may not ever be able to solve it. Soledad, what do you think?
No, because I don't think I could get out of bed if I thought that race was such an intractable problem. I think we've actually made some very notable and very large steps forward over the last 400 years or so. But I would add to Karen's long list of sort of where to apply pressure, the media, because I think media does still shape public opinion. And I am often sort of pushing people to do better in how they think about issues. So, for example, I don't think you're going to have a lot of progress if you can't get the word racist out on a piece of paper. I mean, and people will do all kinds of gymnastics, reporters will do all kinds of gymnastics to, racially charged, racially tinged. They really, really struggle. I mean, it's almost comical if it weren't so serious, to avoid calling people who do racist things over a long period of time racist or bigoted. I think that's problematic. And again, I think social media is a very good way to apply pressure to make sure that newsrooms are held accountable for their headlines and for how they frame stories and for how they think about both sidesing, coverage. I think that's really, really important. Race can't be an intractable issue because I think we have a long runway to try to figure it out. And I think there are certain times in our history where we're more willing than other times to figure it out. But I think this is an inflection point. And I think, as Karen points to those poll numbers, the idea that now white people who consistently have it's almost been the flip, right? And, Black people, is there racism? White people say no in large numbers. Black people say yes in the opposite large number. Now that's actually changed, right? And that means that there's a moment and people's thinking has changed. And I also think the philosophy, if you just talk about policing around a few bad apples, clearly, I mean, there's so many videos that have now come out that even people who are very grateful for the police in their neighborhood and maybe personally haven't had any issues themselves, are seeing too many of these stories that the few bad apples argument just doesn't seem to work anymore. So I think, again, the issue for me is never just to say it's policing or it's housing or it's, work and justice. It's all of the above. And that means some of those solutions, I think, have to be race-based strategies. In America, we're very reluctant to have conversations about race. We're really, really, it's like the third rail of conversations. I think white people are uncomfortable. I think Black people are uncomfortable. So you very rarely have conversations about it. But I don't know if you can get out of a problem around race without having solutions that very overtly talk about race. They can't be race neutral. They can't just be poverty problems. They actually have to be poverty solutions. They have to be solutions that tackle head on the issues of race. And I think we're more willing now to have those conversations bluntly, but are we fully there? Probably not. But I will point out just one quick thing that I think is a real shift. And I think it was Steve who mentioned it. He talked about systems. The idea that we're even talking about systems. I mean, in the newsroom, that is such a shift, right? It was always this police officer or this town or this individual. And we're now talking about the system of racial profiling or systemic racism. And many people really don't know what that actually means. And so the idea that we're even having this conversation as a reporter who's worked on these stories for a long time, to be able to say, like, let's dive into systemic racism is kind of crazy and a very good sign, I would say.
Before we go to some questions and answers from our audience, Steve, from your vantage point, I'd like to hear, as a white American, your view on, sort of the intractability of dealing with the race problem.
Well, I think two things. One is Black people of color have been talking about racism and injustice forever. And racism just sort of shape shifts. And one of the things I think is most important in white people having conversations with white people is for white people to stop telling Black people to solve problems that white people have created. Racism. I mean, these are concepts that were created by white Europeans. And you look at the war on drugs as a simple example. For Black and brown people, it results in human caging. It's a law enforcement issue. It's a crime. When white people become addicted in great numbers to opioids, that's a health issue. That requires treatment and intervention. You look at the different outcomes in schooling, but let me stop right there because it's so obvious in the war on drugs and the racism that has resulted in disproportionate minority confinement and mass incarceration.
So before we do the Q&A, as I said, what I'd like from each of you, if you can, is people want to know, when we can pass laws and whatnot, people want to know what they can do as individuals, sort of practical kinds of things they can do to be a part of the solution and rather than the problem. Congresswoman Bass, do you have any thoughts on that?
Sure. I think that people can become active. And I so appreciate what you said, Steve, you know, we go through this ritual every time we have one of these situations where people want to talk about race, and then they call all the Black people in. And it's like, you know, it gets tiring. It's a burden. And I think, and here's the sad thing is that I think that there's more credibility when white people talk about racism than Black people. When we talk about racism, number one, it's expected, and number two, you're calling the race card. And so I think that there's outstanding white anti-racist activists that can come in and talk to folks. In terms of what people can do, and I've been, needless to say, talking about policing a lot. I don't know how wide the audience is for this show, but wherever you are, check out your own police departments, because trust me, if there's some Black people that live in your area, you have a disproportionate arrest and incarceration rate. And why don't you find out about your own police department? Find out what their arrest rate is. If you have schools that are integrated, find out what the suspension and expulsion rate is, because that's how it all starts. So everyone can take responsibility. Don't view race as an issue that Black people deal with or that other people of colors deals with. It impacts all of us, and it lowers the quality of life for all of us.
Thank you. Soledad?
You know, I'll answer that. Obviously, I think what Congresswoman Bass says is exactly right. And I think white people have a tremendous amount of power that sometimes they don't either know or fail to recognize that they can leverage. And I'll give you an analogy using my poor husband who hates these analogies. But white guy who was often put on manels, men-only panels. He didn't create the panel. He'd be asked to go. He'd go to the panel. And when he'd get there, he'd look around and be like, oh, everybody looks like me on this panel. And he'd say, I didn't really want to do it, but it's not my panel. I didn't set it up. I just went. And I said to him, literally, Mariah Carey and Patti LaBelle do not go do divas until they know who else is on. And this is how you need to think about these things. Like, use your power. When someone asks you to do a panel, you say, well, I will hold the date. And when you confirm for me who else is on this panel, then I'll confirm my availability, right? So and here's what I care about. I need to see at least 2 women of color. I need to see a young man who's, new in the, who's entering the business. I would like to see an older woman who, right now you have the power. If they want you, here's your demand list of what you want. And instead of sort of showing up and saying, I got there, wasn't my panel, I had no control, you instead say, I have lots of control. And if you want me, this is my list of demands. And often I have found that people don't even think about it. Like they don't, it's not necessarily malicious. It's that they just never, ever even considered the makeup of the panel. They check the boxes. And the minute white people start saying, it's not just important to Black people, it's important to me, middle-aged white dude, that there are diverse people on this panel, given a high profile slot, everybody starts thinking about it more. And those little things I actually think can be fairly useful in moving the needle. I mean, I think individuals have to stick up and use and leverage their power to make that change, as opposed to saying, wow, it's really disappointing there are no people of color on this panel. That's just not good enough.
Well, one of the things that I've often thought that people should do is, I, as an African American, I have to know almost everything there is to know about white European history in order to get ahead. White people don't have to know anything about the history of African Americans and people of color to get ahead. They can be quite successful without that. So what I would say is that people need to educate themselves into the real history of this country. The next thing, again, and I don't mean to keep putting this Q&A off, but I was thinking that when apartheid ended in South Africa, one of the things that Nelson Mandela did that I thought was so interesting was they had a truth and reconciliation between Blacks and whites in that country. Do you think, to any of you, do you think something like that needs to happen here for America to sort of really acknowledge what slavery did to Black people in this country and what it's done? Because the racism impacts not just Black people, but white people as well. Anyone?
Yeah,
Karen?
So let me say that here in the House, as a matter of fact, ironically, we're having a press conference tomorrow, the Congressional Black Caucus. The focus of the press conference is systemic racism. And what, last week we focused on policing. We understand that policing is a manifestation of systemic racism, but there's many other manifestations too. Just name an institution and we can talk about systemic racism. And so we have a couple of members, most notably Representative Barbara Lee, who is proposing exactly that. We have a member who is proposing we set up a commission to study the impact of enslavement, because the average American has no idea that slavery lasted 256 years. They think it was a few years and they don't understand why we can't get over it. They don't know that after the period of enslavement for 100 years, we had Jim Crow, we had US apartheid. And so people learning US history, I think, is basic. So we have that legislation. We also have the legislation for a truth and reconciliation process within the United States. And then we need to get rid of all these symbols. I mean, I'm here in the nation's capital. It was built by my enslaved ancestors because the US government rented Africans from around the area, the Washington, DC, Virginia area. And we built this building, and I have to walk around this building every day and walk past mass murderers, people who enslaved my ancestors and did horrific acts. And so you probably saw Speaker Pelosi a couple of weeks ago removed all of the portraits of the speakers who had enslaved Africans. And so we're beginning here to review this process. I mean, heck, the governor of Mississippi signed a bill today removing the Confederate symbol from the flag. So we have a moment here. The door is open on race, and we need to run through it and open that door as wide as possible and see how far we can get this time. We have these moments periodically in this country. This one seems a little more profound than ones I've experienced in other times in my life.
Terrific. Steve, I didn't forget you in your call to action. What are your suggestions?
There are so many things that white people need to learn about the history of racism. And Ibram Kendi, his history stamped from the beginning, I think is one of the greatest sources. It's a bit of a doorstop, but it's worth every word. And for those who want something shorter, just read Nicole Hannah-Jones' Sunday piece in the New York Times Magazine. And we need to look at everything about systemic racism, and we need to open our minds not only to reform efforts, but it may be an unfortunate word that will change, defunding, like getting police out of schools and rethinking why, if schools are so dangerous that we need police in them all the time, would we ever put our children in them? And to think through what Nicole Hannah-Jones articulates beautifully is a really meaningful discussion of reparations leading into truth and reconciliation. Because without ending wealth disparity or making a serious inroad into it, I don't think we'll have successful truth and reconciliation.
Cool. So we have a number of questions from our audience, and I'm going to try and get to some of these. We have a question a woman asked, should schools incorporate the impact of slavery and police brutality incidents into the curriculum at an early age, like middle school? Anyone?
Elementary
School.
Yes.
That's not too early.
Just like U.S. history. Yes.
Another question. Soledad, do you believe that corporate responses are sincere and that real conversations are taking place in CEO offices?
Some. Some are definitely not. Yes, I do believe some are sincere and people are trying to figure it out, partly because I think anything that impacts a lot of your employees is problematic. And so I think organizations are trying to figure out what are they going to do. So yeah, for sure. I've been involved in some of those conversations and I think very sincere and backed by effort and time and money and strategy. And then some are not. Hashtag Black Lives Matter, put out a statement, everybody's good, and move on. And you keep your head down. I think there's a third tier of put your head down, don't say anything, don't do anything, try to stay out of any kind of line of fire, and hope that nobody kind of holds you accountable on any front. So I've seen the range. I think all of us have seen the range of those responses. But yeah, I do think some are sincere. And again, a lot of it driven by Black employees, African-American employees within those organizations who say, having an employee resource group, having an affinity group is good. It's not enough. You know, we have to do what we say we're going to do. And often when I speak to some of these groups, I'll just tell them, why do you bother with the mission statement? Like, this is the opportunity to live your mission statement. And if you're not going to, then don't. I mean, it's fine. Just know that you can't manage to live your mission statement and you should stop talking about it. It's your organization. Do whatever you want. But I think it's, you know, this is the time where people have to make a decision about what they believe and what their values are as a corporation or as an organization or as an industry. I think journalism is going through a very similar thing. You know, we want to have lots of conversations about diversity and justice and fairness. And then you're like, yeah, let's look at our numbers for the last 20 years. They're not good. They're terrible in many instances. And so, you know, it requires a cold, hard look at yourself frequently.
Another very good question is coming. How important is the conversation and the movement for reparations to make the change our society needs to make? Congresswoman?
Well, I think it's absolutely critical. I do think it's tied in with other issues, though, all related. One, learning U.S. history. We like only the nice stories. We want to hear about the cherry tree with George Washington. We don't want to hear about the 300 Africans that his family owned. I think looking at the society's institutions, unfortunately, I think reparations, and I wish I could come up with another word, I think reparations has been ridiculed. And I think it's been ridiculed to say Black folks just want a check, as opposed to the profound examination of inequity in our institutions and a study of how to rid that inequity and then how to cure it, how to remedy it. That is what reparations is about. And I do think it is very, very important. But again, to me, I would tie it to getting rid of institutional racism.
Another very good question from the audience, and this one I'll ask you, Steve. What can local elected officials do, especially those who live in really conservative communities?
I think that if I can speak as Steve Milliken, you know, we've got the so-called leader of our country who is tweeting a video of a white supporter calling for white power. If we don't register people and get out the vote and put people in office who will affect these changes, I mean, we have enormous capacity and tremendous advantage in this country. In the last 2 months, if I can just go back to reparations, I'm not here to say what form that should take, but we raised $2.2 trillion over the COVID for stimulus in 2 months. It seems to me that we can have a serious effort to raise consequential sums to deal with the original sin of America in slavery and the genocide of Native peoples. So I think getting people registered, having people fill out the census, having people get to the polls and voting to get the right people in positions of power is the single most important exercise of a civil right this year.
An interesting question from a Black female who says that she is the CEO of a corporation and she wants to know how she can use her position to make a meaningful difference. Any suggestion?
Yeah, number one, everything comes from the CEO. If the CEO doesn't take it seriously, then no one will take it seriously. Number two, make sure that you're holding your employees accountable. I, many years ago, did an interview with a CEO who talked about moving from a diverse slate hiring, which was always like wink, wink, diverse slate. We put some people in, but we hired who we wanted to, and starting to actually judge people and pay them. They didn't get their bonus if they did not hit whatever the definition of diversity at the organization was. And because the CEO was behind it, he said, you know, I only had to do it once. I only had to give one person less than their bonus. And he said after that, everyone understood that it was real and it was serious, and we had a goal that we were trying to meet. If you treat justice and fairness and diversity and inclusion within your organization like you would treat if you made refrigerators, how you make refrigerators, right? You track it, you figure out what's wrong when it's not working. When people leave your organization, you don't just say, well, I guess we have a lot of Black people who are leaving. You track it, you care, you want to figure out what needs to be changed in the organization. That's all stuff that a CEO can do. And then I think the last piece of that is step back and let other people lead, right? Empower the people around you. You know, it is very important to you. You are the CEO. This is an important, essential mission, because if she doesn't take it seriously, no one else will bother to take it seriously. And then make sure that your underlings are now coming up with solutions. It can't be the Black woman CEO pushing the solutions. It has to be all of her employees who want to be involved in this conversation making change.
Congresswoman, there's a question for you from a person in the audience. Says part of this moment is the increased awareness in the mental health community of race-based trauma. How can BLM inform changes in mental health care legislation?
How can Black Lives Matter inform?
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I think we definitely need to have mental health. I think maybe what the person is referring to is the microaggressions and a stress from race. I mean, racism is a public health issue. You know, everybody found out, by the way, it was a really surprising discovery that African Americans have disproportionate rates of high blood pressure and diabetes and other illnesses. All of those illnesses are stress related as well. Stress impacts those illnesses, and racism causes tremendous stress. And so that might be what that person is referring to. And I think that, you know, in the richest country in the history of the world, we should have free medical care, and there should be parity with mental health as well as physical health care.
And I think people also, if I may add to that, have to understand, we did a documentary about stop and frisk in New York City, and we profiled a young man who had been stopped about 100 times. And he described how painful it is to be pushed up against the wall of a building and have someone search through your backpack when that building is your college campus and your professors are walking by, and trying to articulate the sheer humiliation of what it's like to be stopped and frisked, and it happens consistently to him. And I think sometimes, like, I've spent a lot of time as a reporter trying to make everybody who doesn't understand it, like, to really understand the depths of what it means to feel afraid for your life, to teach your children how to survive a police interaction from about the time that they're 13 years old, and how devastating that is, and what the mental implications are of all of that. It's really, really difficult. It's actually why when you were talking about when do you start, you know, teaching this to students, I don't know. There are days when I think some of these conversations are really tough. So I don't know when you start talking about these issues to you know, is middle school? I don't know. So I think that that's part of it. I think it's really important that people begin to understand the impact that systemic racism has on people. And I also, the word white privilege are not words that I like particularly, because I think for a lot of white people, they don't feel very privileged. And so they think of that as, you know, oh, you're saying I'm better than you in some capacity, and they don't feel it. And I actually wish we had a better way of explaining and talking to people about the benefit of your skin color, what that buys you in a society that is basically a racist society. I have found that white privilege takes a lot of rounds of conversation for people who aren't having intellectual discussions about it, for people to really understand. And I find that a little challenging.
And Steve, there's a question that someone asked of you. What are the best ways that individual white citizens can raise the issues of systematic racism with their friends?
I would say just talking to every single person that, you know, a white person meets with, whether it's family, friends, the proverbial, calling racist remarks at the Thanksgiving table, when you experience racism and you see something, say something. And I think also having some seminars, for example, I learned from Nicole Hannah-Jones in that article that at least 6,500 Black people were lynched from the end of the Civil War to 1950, an average of 2 a week for 9 decades. Now, fast forward, nearly 5 Black people on average have been killed a week by law enforcement since 2015. I think people feel that history of slavery and Jim Crow and lynching is ancient history, and we've moved so far beyond it. But the number of Black people killed by law enforcement today is 2.5 times what it was between the Civil War and 1960.
Which brings me to another question from our audience, which I think is a very good one, which is part of the progress that was made in South Africa is that the government acknowledged and admitted its racism. Representative Bass, does that need to happen here?
Absolutely, it needs to happen here. I mean, it's shameful. It's just shameful that we can't acknowledge, we don't even admit it happened. We can't acknowledge 256 years, 100 years. We can't even acknowledge, we can't pass a law, a federal law against lynching. It's 2020. We tried to pass that law about 3 weeks ago. Rand Paul, one senator, held it up. So, it's very hard to deal with these issues if your own government will not even acknowledge. Now, I'm hoping, in 128 days, we have an opportunity to get past some of this mess we've experienced over these last 3.5 years. And I'm hoping that the next president will be able to say, we did this. We could learn a lot from Germany, I think. We could learn a lot from Germany. We could learn a lot from South Africa. So that, and I know you know this, that when the Afrikaners were going to set up apartheid, they came here to study the South. They spent time in the South and said, let's see how they do it there. And then they went back and started apartheid.
Indeed. So is it just that people are in denial, or is it active racism that people just don't? I mean, for instance, Senator Mitch McConnell made just an incredible statement, among many that he makes, but he said that America had paid its debt for slavery by electing Barack Obama.
Well, and added on to that, he said that his ancestors owned slaves, and so did Obama's. So they were equal. He also added that on as well. So your question, is it active or is it denial? I mean, you have to have some level of knowledge to have denial. I would say the majority of Americans don't have the basic knowledge. And so I do think there are people here that I work with who, they're going to argue over why we had the Civil War, okay? So, those are folks who do know and they're choosing to deny. But I do think that there's Americans who just simply do not know. And I think that's why they were shaken to their core when they saw George Floyd murdered.
Another very good question from the audience. Steve, I'll ask you to handle this one. How can the public work to get a more equitable judiciary? We're seeing President Trump stacking the courts with far right-wing justices at not just the Supreme Court, but at the lower levels. It's the appellate levels, the associate levels. How can the public, is there anything the public can do?
For appointed judges, throw the rascals out who are appointing them. That's number one. And number two, people are not aware that in many jurisdictions, judges are elected. And so voting for the local DA, voting for a judge in a local jurisdiction is vitally important. I think there's going to be a tremendous fight against reducing qualified immunity for law enforcement officers. And I just hope, Congresswoman Bass, that you are successful in legislating that subject successfully to hold people accountable. And I go back to the voting because right now it's essential that we change the people who are making judicial selection. That's probably the most consequential aspect of the November election in the context of presidential appointment of judges and senatorial confirmation.
At this point, I'd like to ask each of you what sort of parting words you would have to our audience and to Americans in general to for dealing with the problems of race and social inequality in America. Representative Bass?
Yeah, well, first of all, I am extremely hopeful. I am. I mean, we're in one of these moments, and if you live long enough, you'll experience these moments. And I think when we are in these moments, you grab them. You grab them and you make the most out of them. You take the energy and you channel it. And I think that's where we are right now. And the most important thing I would say is that we really have to educate ourselves. So I've been telling everybody an easy documentary to watch, 13. I mean, it's not easy. The subject matter is tough. It's about the 13th Amendment. To understand policing, to understand the criminal justice system, and to understand how it is fundamentally tied to the period of enslavement, and how, as Brian Stevenson so eloquently says, that slavery didn't end, it just evolved. And I just think it's very, very important to educate yourself, to share that education with other people, and to take responsibility for your own environment. Soledad is great in describing a lot of different ways to do that, whether it's the corporate C Street or going down to your local police department, learning about what's happening in your local community. And I know what you'll find there, so do something about it. Raise it in a city council meeting. Ask why the black folks, the 10 black folks that live there, 5 of them get arrested or are stopped every day.
Soledad?
So I'm going to answer your question with a story. My parents were in interracial marriage in 1958 when in Maryland. They were both at Johns Hopkins. Interracial marriage was illegal. They went to DC, got hitched, drove back to Baltimore, and lived illegally. My mom, I used to ask her all the time, so what was it like when my 2 older sisters were born in Baltimore in 1960 and 1961? And my mom described it in a way that was so shocking to me. She said, people used to spit on us as we walked down the street as a family. I was horrified, like horrified. And I said, Mom, what did you do? And she used to say this thing that I thought was very useful, certainly for me as a journalist, and how I think people need to think about this issue. She said, Lovey, because she used to call me Lovey, she passed away last year. She said, Lovey, we knew America was better than that. And I always thought, like, the way it was framed is this idea of, so you have to opt in to those things and help make it better. There's no opting out and sitting around and watching it. And I think for every single person who's frustrated or scared or unhappy or mad or whatever, anxious, I think you have to think, well, okay, so, America's better than that. What do I need to do to opt in to be part of getting it to go the direction that I think it should be going? I think it's as simple as that. And not everybody's list is going to be the same, but everybody does have to opt in some capacity if it's something that they care about.
Steve?
I think one of the most encouraging things about this movement is its diversity and its breadth. It is all around the world. And I would say to everyone, and especially to white people, keep this movement going. Just focus on what happened in Lafayette Square when military, police, and military equipment were deployed to absolutely wipe out a peaceful protest, and one of those sacred places to exercise the First Amendment right peaceably to assemble and to redress your government over grievances. That space, Lafayette Square, was fenced. And when you think of the deployment by the Department of Justice of unmarked troops with no names, no badge names of the officers that represented the Bureau of Prisons riot strike force being deployed against peaceful protesters. We need to meet that by coming out more often, in greater numbers, and for a longer period of time to keep the flywheel of this movement going.
Absolutely. One other question that I meant to ask earlier is about, and this was a question also that came from the audience, if we can get back to it, is how do we help close the wealth gap between African Americans and white people? I mean, it seemed, we make progress, we get good jobs. There's a sort of 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and yet the gap between Black income and white income continues to widen. What's causing that? How do we deal with it? Representative Bass?
It's no small matter because it has to be addressed in multiple ways. First of all, we have to address what is going on right now with COVID, where you have hundreds of thousands of African Americans that just lost their jobs, the ones that are struggling, especially the ones who are working on the front lines in the essential workers in various businesses. So we are supporting on the Congressional Black Caucus. We have an entire agenda on wealth and addressing inequity. So looking at small businesses, supporting Black businesses because they're going to hire Black people more likely, supporting education and training. So you can't just look at one thing or one system to deal with income inequality. You have to look at what is creating the barriers. We are going to have a terrible problem once COVID is over because of the lack of technology, access to technology. When all of our kids are at home, it's easy to say, go home to your laptop. That's assuming, number one, you have the technology. That's also assuming your community has broadband. That's assuming, if you're especially a young child, that your parents know how to operate the computer to help you with your homework. So all of these months that these young people are out of school, that's going to add to the inequity because of the lack of resources that existed before. So we have an immediate agenda in the Black Caucus, but we're also developing an agenda to respond to the post-COVID world if we ever get there.
Exactly.
And I'd add debt to that. We really have to take a very cold, hard look at college debt. Black students go in with more debt. They take longer to pay off their debt. They're often in school longer, which takes on more debt. And debt is a huge, huge piece of that wealth gap, right? Because if you have debt, you can't really, buy a house or do investments, et cetera, et cetera.
I have a fairly simplistic approach, and it is raise taxes and really strongly progressively so that we can heal these racist disparities in health. There should be universal health care. There should be free education through college. There should be fair and affordable housing for everyone. There should be equal opportunities in employment, and that's how we'll reduce the disparities in wealth. We have criminally skewed the tax system to favor the rich. And there's a classmate of ours, Sylvester, who said, justice to me means the opportunities in life are parceled out equally at birth. That should be our benchmark.
Absolutely. Well, I'd like to, before I turn this back over to Marian, I would just like to personally thank my stellar panel here, Congresswoman Karen Bass, Soledad O'Brien, and Steve Milliken. It's been a wonderful discussion, and I think that these kinds of discussions need to happen more often and all over the United States. So, guys, thank you very much for being with me today. And at this point, I'd like to hand things back over to Marian.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Sylvester.
Wow.
Thank you.
Thank you so, so much for this extraordinary conversation. We are grateful to all of you, to Representative Bass, to Soledad, Sylvester, and Steve. And I promise all of those who are listening, we are going to post all this information that was in the chat. I know there was a lot and you all want to educate yourselves. And that leads me to the Class Act calls to action. The first one is, as you have done this evening, educate yourself about systemic racism and engage in constructive and compassionate conversation with others, especially with those with whom you think you may disagree. Make sure you are registered to vote and exercise your constitutional right to vote. There are those who don't know about their right to vote, so help them learn about it and help them register so that they too can exercise that constitutional right. And finally, make sure everyone you know completes the census. So I thank, on behalf of Class Act and all who have been here this evening, we thank you, our panelists, and Sylvester for an extraordinary conversation. We also thank Donna Brown-Guillaume for her leadership in creating this forum, and as well as Sarah Greenberg, Therese Steiner, Rick Brotman, Diana Labanchu, and Katie Marinello for making it a reality. This is the 5th Class Act Zoom forum since the beginning of the pandemic. Videos from this forum, as well as all those resources that we saw in the chat, will be posted on our website, classacthr73.org, in a few days, and we hope you will share them with everyone you know. We will also be notifying you that they will be available when they are. If you've missed our previous forums, they are also on our website on the COVID-19 pages. Finally, civil rights, voting rights, and women's rights leader Fannie Lou Hamer said, "Nobody's free until everybody's free." May this evening's dialogue inspire us to work together for the change that will set us all free. Good evening.